composite wing and aerostructure manufacture and modular construction and shipping. Given their economic importance, can I ask that the UK government looks again at the future of the whole site operation at Spirit as well as Harland and Wolff to ensure those investments and jobs stay in Northern Ireland?
I'd like to thank the member for raising this important aspect of business innovation and these important businesses for Northern Ireland's economy. We're working with the Northern Ireland Executive to ensure the best outcome for Short Brothers and its staff for Spirit. The Department for Business and Trade remains in contact with Spirit, Airbus, Boeing and other potential buyers. We want to see an outcome that includes a commitment to develop Short Brothers and its supply chain as part of any acquisition and provides the best possible opportunity for growth in Northern Ireland. The Department for Business and Trade continues to provide over £13 million of support for Short Brothers research and development activity.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr Speaker, Northern Ireland is at the forefront across these islands for fibre broadband due to our confidence and supply deal with the previous government. But what's been done, can the Minister indicate, to promote this golden innovative opportunity nationally, which would help small businesses right across Northern Ireland?
This government is working right across the whole of the UK to promote those businesses. So the industrial strategy provides an excellent opportunity for this discussion as well. The UK government is working with business, trade unions, local and devolved leaders, experts, international partners to develop that industrial strategy, which will really cement this work and growth. And 8 growth-driving sectors have been identified, some of those which the member identified already: advanced manufacturing, clean energy industries, creative industries, and so on. The transition to net zero also provides huge opportunities, which we will make the most of.
Mr Speaker, has the Minister studied yet the National Semiconductor Strategy for Ireland published by the Irish Government? And if so, can she say how Northern Ireland will be able to exploit that strategy and the whole of the United Kingdom compete with Ireland, which has plainly identified this as an important growth sector going forward?
Thank you, and I thank the member for raising this. This is an excellent opportunity to raise something which I haven't looked at yet, but I will go away and study this because that sounds like a very important aspect of our joint working. And we do have many also international business opportunities to work with our counterparts in the Republic of Ireland, and I will take that up with them as well.
Thank you. Can I associate myself with the condolences to the widow of the late Ken Reid and his family? The family are constituents of mine in North Antrim, and Ken was such a part of the political architecture and features. In terms of innovation, there is no greater trailblazer in Northern Ireland than Wrightbus in my constituency, which in terms of hydrogen has really set the pace. How far is the government invested in advancing that and ensuring that public funds, when they're needed, are there to build the hydrogen infrastructure, which is so key to that matter advancing?
I thank the member for singing the praises of Wrightbus absolutely rightly. The transition to net zero presents huge opportunities, as he's raised. Businesses like Wrightbus in Ballymena are producing 1,000 low-carbon buses, which are securing 500 jobs in their factory and creating 1,500 additional jobs across the UK supply chain, and show that Northern Ireland is leading the way. And we will continue to work with opportunities like this in our industrial strategy, making sure that we continue.
Question 2, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
I'd like to thank the member for Newcastle-under-Lyme for raising this issue and start by paying tribute to Anna Lowe, who passed away earlier this month. As the first ethnic minority politician elected to the Assembly, she was a trailblazer, and I extend my sympathies to her family and friends. The Northern Ireland Assembly currently has no members from ethnic minorities or people from ethnic minority backgrounds. I've met with many community groups who've raised this with me. The key to changing this is the membership and selection process of the political parties in Northern Ireland, and what we all can do as members to speak with people from ethnic minority backgrounds and represent them.
Madam Joe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and happy birthday to the Secretary of State for yesterday. I join the Minister in paying tribute to Anna Lowe, and a happy Lancashire Day too, sir. Anna was the first non-white member of the Assembly, but she can't be the last. And so can I urge the Minister to encourage all the parties in the Assembly to redouble their efforts to ensure that all the people of Northern Ireland can look to their Assembly and see someone like them.
I thank the member, and I recently met Lillian Senoy Barr, who's the first mayor in Northern Ireland from an ethnic minority background, who's showing the way for others. I agree that people must see their representation, and so that I would also join him in urging all the parties across Northern Ireland to look at their selection processes, their invitations to meetings, and make sure that all the parties are welcome to everyone from every background.
Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Jay Basra is a 20-year-old Ulster Unionist candidate who ran in mid-Ulster at the last general election. Jay describes himself as Punjabi British. When he announced his candidacy, he received a torrent of online abuse, which he described as being dehumanising and abhorrent. And what he actually said, it reduces me down to my skin colour rather than myself as a person. But he has also said, Mr. Speaker, if anything, I'm even more determined to run again and increase the Ulster Unionist vote like he did in the general election. What words of encouragement does the Secretary of State have for people like Jay?
I'm horrified to hear of that online abuse, and I'm horrified to hear of any abuse that any politicians receive. And I commend him for his courage in saying, actually, this is not putting me off, I want to stand again. And the honourable member is quite right to raise this, as we all would want to do, and show support for him and for others who want to be able to say that they would be able to stand and not receive that abuse, and we should call it out whenever we see it.
Bambos Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 4.
Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 4, 6 and 11 together. This government is providing the Executive with an £18.2 billion funding settlement for 2025-26. This represents a £1.5 billion increase on this year and is the largest settlement since devolution. It is now for the Executive to decide how this funding is spent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the essential aspects of the reconciliation process arising from the Good Friday Agreement was the need to facilitate and encourage integrated education. So will the Minister join me in welcoming the continued support for integrated education in the autumn budget?
I certainly will, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, because poll after poll in Northern Ireland shows that there is strong support from the public. At the moment, I think, from memory, it's about 8% of pupils who study in integrated schools. I hope we would all like to see that number increase, and my honourable friend and indeed the Education Secretary last week visited an integrated school, the Education Secretary being, I think, the 15th Minister, apart from myself, who has visited Northern Ireland since the election.
Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his response. Does he agree with me that the recent budget gives the Northern Ireland Executive the opportunity to really go for growth after many years of uncertainty?
Well, I do, because there's no doubt that the funding that they received as a result of the budget was more than they had anticipated, but all government is about making choices with the resources you've got, the income that you can raise, and deciding on what your priorities are. But I think it provides a very sound foundation for the Northern Ireland Executive to take the decisions that they need to.
Lillian Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree that to ensure sustainable finances, the Northern Ireland Executive needs to set out clear steps to reform both the NHS and broader public services?
I do agree with that, because as my honourable friend and the House will know, the longest waiting lists in the health service in the United Kingdom are to be found in Northern Ireland. And that is not acceptable, above all for the people who are waiting far too long. There is a plan for reform, which I welcome, but the people of Northern Ireland want to see progress happening.
Conor Lockhart.
Mr.
Mr Speaker, just last week I attended and spoke at a rally hosted by the Ulster Farmers Union in response to the change to agricultural property relief. It was attended by 6,000 farmers with every political party in Northern Ireland standing together in opposition to the change. When will the Government acknowledge that their figures are not reflective of the average farm and that this death tax will result in the break-up of family farms as we know them, in the selling of land to pay the tax and the purchasing of devalued land by big businesses who are not interested in using it for feeding our nation? Can the Secretary of State outline if he has shared the concerns of Northern Ireland farmers with the Chancellor?
Well, I have spoken both to the Environment Secretary and a Minister in the Treasury about this, and I understand that those changes are unwelcome and difficult, but given the fiscal position, the Government is having to take difficult decisions. I would, however, say there is a difference of view about how many farms are going to be affected, and the Treasury estimate around 500 claims a year. And you cannot infer from land values an inheritance tax liability because it depends on the ownership structure of the farm.
Alex Easton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, while the Secretary of State knows that there's extra funding for the running of the PSNI and the issues with police recruitment, there's also the issue of not having a new police college. Could the Secretary of State give me a commitment that he will speak to the First and Deputy First Minister and Justice Minister to make sure that police college is built at Kinniger?
Well, that is an issue for the executive indeed, but the position on police funding, as the honourable member has alluded to, has been improved with the additional money that has been given to the PSNI by the executive out of the extra funding that the budget provided, and the UK Government has also increased the additional security funding which is given in recognition of the security needs in Northern Ireland.
John Cooper.
Mr Speaker, thank you. With 14 miles between my constituency of Dumfries and Galloway and Northern Ireland, I know how much we have in common. Unfortunately, something we also share is that hospitality businesses in Northern Ireland and in much of Scotland are not benefiting from a 75% discount on business rates bills. This is not headwinds, Mr Speaker. To quote Van Morrison, this is a full-force gale. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that paired with national employers' national insurance contributions, rather than growing the economy on both sides of the North Channel, we are threatening jobs, stopping investment, jacking up prices and putting business viability at risk?
Well, the businesses I meet in Northern Ireland are vibrant and looking forward to the future. Of course, the increase in employer national insurance contribution presents challenges for some businesses, but there is no getting away, if I may say to the honourable gentleman, from the fiscal inheritance that this government found when we arrived in office, and the foundations had to be fixed, and that's what we're doing.
Secretary of State Alex Burkall.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to associate this side of the House with the remarks that the Honourable Lady made about Ken Reid. I know that he will be very much missed, and a belated happy birthday to the Secretary of State for yesterday. At the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee last week, the Secretary of State suggested that the Treasury has not yet conducted a detailed analysis of how the budget will affect farmers in Northern Ireland. Has he now asked them to do so?
Well, the Treasury has conducted an analysis of the overall number of farms that they think will be affected, and it's very important that people look at all of the arrangements that we put in place, including individuals can pass, as he will know, 1.5 million on to their family members, couples up to 3 million. When you add all the allowances together, payment over 10 years interest-free, and of course land transferred 7 years before death can go to children with no inheritance tax paid. I should have congratulated the honourable gentleman on his double-hatted appointment as Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, as well as Shadow Secretary of State. He will now have a merry conversation with himself about the Windsor framework.
Alex Burkall.
Well, and I hope conversations with the right honourable gentleman. The Secretary of State will know that the make-up of farming in Northern Ireland is slightly different to the rest of the UK. There is a greater density of farms in sole ownership, and agricultural land is worth more. And this means that farms in Northern Ireland are more exposed to Labour's family farms tax. The farmers I've met in Northern Ireland are deeply concerned about this, and nationally, as he says, there is a disagreement about the figures. On one side, we have the government that says not many farms will be affected. On the other side, we have the experts who say that very many farms will be affected. Transparency will help everyone. So, will the Secretary of State commit to asking the Chancellor to publish detailed Treasury working of the budget's impact on farms in Northern Ireland so that independent experts can check their figures?
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman that to understand the impact, you have to look at the ownership structure of each individual farm, and I'm not entirely sure that he is advocating that the government should do that for all of the farms right across the country. It will be for farmers themselves to look at the arrangements that will apply from 2026 and to take advice on how they can ensure that they are able to continue to pass their family farms to their children and their grandchildren.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Jess Brownfeller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Total income from farming in Northern Ireland fell by 44% last year, amid volatile markets, soaring costs and declining output. And over 6,000 Northern Ireland farmers recently gathered in the Icon Information Centre to highlight the impact that these APR changes will have for their sector. So with dairy farming facing serious economic challenges, gross agricultural output declining, can the Secretary of State commit to publishing a full impact assessment of APR removal for Northern Ireland's farming sector, as well as its wider implications?
Well, as I indicated in answer to the same question that I was asked a moment ago, I don't see how, until you understand what the ownership structure is of each farm, how you can do an impact assessment that will be the answer to the question that the honourable member is seeking. But I would urge all farmers, now they know what the new arrangements are going to be, to take advice. There's a number of things that they can do. But I did meet last week the Ulster Farmers Union. I met a number of young farmers, and I'm in no doubt about the concern that they have expressed. It's really important that we discuss it on the basis of the facts and people look at how they can plan for their future.
Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 5.
Sir Keir Starmer.
It was a pleasure to sign the heads of terms for the Mid-South West Growth Deal alongside the First Minister, Deputy First Minister and Minister for Finance on the 6th of November. These deals are a partnership between the Northern Ireland Executive, the UK Government, local authorities and businesses, and the aim of our joint investment in all 4 deals is to encourage economic growth in Northern Ireland.
Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the Business and Trade Select Committee, I am pleased to see that Belfast has seen a successful economic redevelopment, partly driven by embracing its heritage, which will now be further supported by the Belfast Region City Growth Deal. Does the Minister agree with me that we must continue to support heritage as a regenerative tool in Northern Ireland and the wider UK with deals like this?
Well, I do indeed agree with my honourable friend. These deals are all about partnerships and places, including their heritage, and all of those are an integral part of the approach. And in Belfast, the City deal is roaring ahead with things like the Advanced Manufacturing Centre and considerable investment in digital.
Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the government's focus on growth and especially greenlighting the City and Growth deals and their transformative impact on our often overlooked economy and infrastructure. The forthcoming Windsor Framework Review presents an opportunity to look not just at East-West trade, which is very important, but other overlooked issues to allow us to realise the growth potential of our unique trading arrangements. Will the Minister consider an ambitious terms of reference for that review that allows us to maximise growth and innovation by exploring issues like dual market access and North-South cooperation?
As set out in law, whether there is an independent review depends on the outcome of the consent vote that will take place in the Northern Ireland Assembly. If the government would be under a legal obligation to commission a review if it's not passed with cross-community consent, I would expect the review to focus on Articles 5 to 10 of the Windsor Framework, but it would be for the reviewer to consider how they conduct the review themselves.
Gavin Robbins.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the remarks from the Minister of State around Ken Reid? He was a colossus of Northern Ireland politics and journalism more broadly and across the country, so thank you for those comments. The Secretary of State will know that getting the City and Growth deals back on track was good, following the disappointment of the pause that followed the incoming government. He will also know that there was a commitment in the spring budget for support for a skills and education centre at Crusaders Football Club for £2.2 million. That remains paused. I think the Minister of State has taken an interest in this project, and I'd be very keen that the Secretary of State would confirm he will raise it with the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I'm aware of the pause that affects the particular project to which the Right Honourable Gentleman refers. Consideration will then have to be given as to how that may or may not be taken forward, but I note his interest and I will follow developments carefully.
Gavin Robinson. Grateful, Mr. Speaker, to the Secretary of State for that. And in considering city and growth deals, he knows that this is about economic growth and ensuring prosperity within Northern Ireland. Is he aware of the concerns amongst businesses in England and Wales and Scotland who are now saying that as a result of the general product safety standards emanating from the European Union, that they cannot send their products to Northern Ireland, in stark contrast to the British Government's position to maintain standards on CE markings with the European Union? And what advice and support can he give those businesses who want to trade within their own country and consumers in Northern Ireland who want to buy from within their own country but are currently frustrated from doing so?
Well, advice is being provided about the general product safety regulation. Many companies already meet the terms of it because they are exporting from the UK to the European Union. So there are steps that some businesses will have to take. But I hope the impact of that is going to be very small because there is a way to get through it.
Smith.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Minister. Why, please.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 8, 10 and 12 together. White Ribbon Day this week marks the start of 16 days of activism against violence against women and girls. The scale of this violence in our country is unacceptable, and this government is treating it as the national emergency that it is. Every woman and girl deserves to feel safe wherever she is. The scale of violence against women and girls is unacceptable. That's why the Labour government has set out our ambition to halve violence against women and girls within a decade. The government wants to take a joined-up approach across the UK, and I have discussed this issue with the First and Deputy First Ministers and Deputy Prime Minister together. We will continue to work collaboratively with the Executive.
Look, we want to get to PMQs, and I'm going to achieve it at this rate. David Smith.
Thank the Minister for that reply. According to Women's Aid, a fifth of all crime in Northern Ireland is domestic abuse. But we know that paramilitary organisations make reporting, confronting or escaping such abuse even more difficult. How is the Government working with the Northern Ireland Executive to break down these coercive barriers to support for women and girls?
I'd like to thank the member for raising this. Alongside the alarming femicide statistics, there are additional factors that add to the complexity of gender-based violence in Northern Ireland, which are very important to recognise and take action to present. Paramilitarism is one of those. We need to tackle the grip of paramilitaries to end this abuse.
Mr. Strother.
Mr. Speaker, the theme of this year's White Ribbon Day is It Starts With Men. Would the Minister agree with me that it is incumbent on all of us, and especially men, to play our part in stamping out violence against women and girls wherever we find it? And how is she working with the Executive in Northern Ireland to deliver on our shared mission to do exactly that?
Thank you, and I'm delighted to see so many men raising this issue today here in Northern Ireland Questions. Absolutely, we all have a role to play. Yesterday I met with Tani McCorry from White Ribbon, Northern Ireland, who's working with men in football teams, GAA teams and in prisons. We all have a role to play to have those difficult conversations to really change our society.
Chris Bloor.
Mr. Speaker, the Northern Ireland Executive Strategic Framework to End Violence Against Women and Girls acknowledges the rise of online influencers who have a toxic influence on men and boys. Can the Minister provide an update and discussion she has had on sharing best practice on how to challenge these influencers and promote healthier and safer attitudes towards consent and relationships across the UK?
I'm very supportive of the Executive's framework, the strategic framework to tackle violence against women and girls. I'm in constant dialogue with organisations like White Ribbon NI to learn and share best practice. That's how we're going to achieve this, in partnership with the Executive. And the Government is also committed to tackling online abuse and violence against women and girls with the Online Safety Act and further work that we'll be doing on this.
Jim Shannon.
I know that's not for me, but
Well deserved.
Ministers, in Northern Ireland last year, 6 women were murdered by men. They've all been arrested and their cases are pending. 800 women and children stayed in the Women's Aid Refuge, and last year in the Women's Refuge 10 babies were born. There's an epidemic of violence against women in Northern Ireland. What can the Minister of State do in discussions with those at the Northern Ireland Assembly to make it better? Thank you so much.
I'd like to pay tribute to all of the women's aides across Northern Ireland. They do absolutely fantastic work. So it's prevention, it's provision of services, it's tackling online abuse and tackling abuse and violence against women and girls wherever we see it, by everyone in this House and across the UK. That's the only way that we're going to really change this situation.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree that the low number of police officers in Northern Ireland hinders the fight against violence against women and girls? And will she work with the Executive to ensure that the number of officers increased to the 7,500 recommended?
The action by police officers is absolutely fundamental, and looking at how we can change the justice system, as we are doing across the UK, as our target to halve violence against women and girls, is essential. But it's much more than that. It's about a whole of society change. It's about tackling misogyny wherever we see it. It's about every organisation getting involved in this. So actions by the police are one part of this, but it's so much more than that.
Minister Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And following on from honourable friend's question, key to reducing violence against women and girls is, of course, effective policing. That was a clear commitment in New Decade, New Approach. By when does the Minister expect the policing numbers in Northern Ireland to reach those levels set out in that commitment?
In the budget recently, this government provided a record-breaking devolution settlement of 18.2 billion, with 640 million this year, 1.5 million next year, and it's up to the Chief Constable now to be spending those figures.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Daisy Cooper.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the sympathies of everyone in this House will be with those affected by the devastating flooding that we've seen recently. And our thanks goes to all those working tirelessly to support the affected communities. Mr. Speaker, we've committed £2.4 billion over the next 2 years to build, maintain and repair vital defences to protect more communities from the awful impact of the flooding. Mr. Speaker, the ceasefire announced in Lebanon is long overdue, but demonstrates that diplomacy can succeed even in the most challenging of circumstances. We must seize this opportunity to build trust, de-escalate tensions and push for a wider ceasefire. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I associate myself with those remarks of those of the Prime Minister? West Hertfordshire Hospital Trust has eliminated 65-week waits, and they have now met all 3 national cancer standards. These remarkable achievements by the staff are happening despite the fact that they are working in terrible buildings that are life expired and crumbling. If the government is looking for a project that is high-performing and shovel-ready, this is it. So will the Prime Minister give our trust the green light to build a new hospital without any further delay?
I thank her for raising the issue and obviously of importance to her constituents and beyond. Look, the new hospital programme that we inherited was a failure of the previous government. We are committed to delivering. We're reviewing to make sure we can deliver. The Health Secretary set out further details, but I'm very happy for her to have a meeting with the relevant minister if she wants to follow up on the specifics. Thank you.
Chris Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Residents in Red House Park in my constituency are suffering from soaring management fees and poor service from their leaseholder management company. Recent BBC reporting has once again demonstrated the consequences of the outdated and feudal leasehold system. All of them are frustrated by the broken promises of the previous government, so will the Prime Minister reassure them that this government will introduce legislation as soon as possible to resolve the leaseholder and leaseholder crisis?
Mr. Speaker, yes, we will do so. I agree that the last government totally failed to tackle the unfairness of the leasehold system. We will provide homeowners with more powers, protection and greater rights by bringing that legislation forward. Thank you.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the CBI conference on Monday, the Chancellor said, and I quote, "I'm clear, I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes." I know that telling the truth to this House is important to the Prime Minister. So will he repeat his Chancellor's pledge now?
Mr. Speaker, we set out our position at the budget that was just set out. We're fixing the foundations. We're dealing with the £22 billion black hole that they left. I'm not going to write the next 5 years of budgets here at this dispatch box. But, Mr. Speaker, we said we wouldn't hit the pay slips of working people. We passed the budget, we invest in the future, and we kept that promise.
Mr. Speaker, he's not fixing any foundations, he's making everything worse. The whole House would have heard him refuse to repeat the Chancellor's pledge, a pledge as worthless as the manifesto promises that he's talking about. If he is fixing foundations, why is it that the PMI index shows that business confidence has crashed since the budget?
Mr. Speaker, we're fixing the foundation. We've got record investment into this country. But she talks about tax rises. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, she stood there and said that she wanted all the investment, all the benefits of the budget, but she didn't know how she was going to pay for it. I noticed that, having come here criticising the national insurance rises over and over again, on Monday she admitted that she wouldn't reverse the position that we set out. Meanwhile, her science minister was saying he was going energetically to do the opposite. They really haven't got a clue what they're doing.
Mr. Speaker, if he wants to know what Conservatives would do, he should resign and find out. Until then...
I'll decide when there's more.
Mr. Speaker, until then, I'm the one asking the questions. There's a petition out there, 2 million people asking him to go. He's the one who doesn't know. He's the one who doesn't know how things work. It is not government that creates growth, Mr. Speaker. It is business. His employment secretary, I don't see her here, she wants more young people in work. But businesses say they are cutting jobs because of the Chancellor's budget. His Deputy Prime Minister, she is not here. Her employment rights bill will stop businesses hiring. That's what they say. The CBI said on Monday that the dots of the government's policy don't join up. They're right, aren't they?
Mr. Speaker, on Monday she said that she wouldn't reverse the increase in national insurance. Yesterday, on their legacy legislation, their predecessor, they couldn't decide what their position was. Today, they've launched a policy commission asking other people to give them some ideas for government. And she talks about a petition. We had a massive petition on the 4th of July in this country. We spent years taking our party from a party of protest to a party of government. They're hurtling in the opposite direction.
What a load of nonsense, Mr. Speaker. We had a budget in March this year, and tractors were not blockading the streets of Whitehall afterwards. So let me give him another example of a real business. Following his budget, the head of McVitie's has said that it has been harder to understand what the case for investment in the UK is. So while the Prime Minister has been hobnobbing in Brazil, businesses have been struggling to digest his budget. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the Employment Rights Bill shows that it is not only the ginger nut that is causing him problems?
I was attending the G20. I suspect on their current trajectory, they don't know whether they're going to attend the G20 or not. Maybe the Policy Commission will come up with an answer on that one. But we've had record investment from overseas investment into this country. and she keeps carping from the sidelines. She says at this dispatch book, she wants all the benefits of the budget, all the investment, but she doesn't want to pay for any of it. Mr. Speaker, she's racked up £6.7 billion of unfunded commitments in just 3 weeks as leader of the opposition. So once the company of the economy, we're the ones growing the economy.
Mr. Speaker, the investment he's taking credit for was our work. I was Business Secretary. We negotiated those deals that he announced. But the bottom line is that in all that he has said, he doesn't seem to care about the young people who will lose their jobs as a result of his budget. Perhaps he can show more concern for the 1,100 people who found out yesterday that they could lose their jobs at Vauxhall's plant in Luton. So while he flies around making unilateral commitments, back home, the real-world effects are businesses closing in Bedfordshire and Basildon. Does the Prime Minister stand by his promise to ban the sale of petrol cars by 2030, even if more jobs will be lost?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't normally invite a heckle, but that one was accurate. Mr. Speaker, the question of the position of jobs in Luton is a very serious one, and families and workers will be very worried, and we are obviously engaging with them. I would remind the Leader of the Opposition that the EV mandates that are an issue in this particular case were actually introduced by the last government. I would also remind her that she was the Business Secretary that introduced them. We're getting on with supporting those communities. She's shouting from the sideline.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, he clearly didn't read his briefing about the EV mandate. The fact is, we changed the date and made it easier for people. Everything he has done is attack people. The budget was an attack on farmers, an attack on workers, an attack on pensioners, an attack on the young, and an attack on thousands of charities and businesses across the country. The whole system is broken, Mr. Speaker, and he is making things worse. He is making things worse. Mr. Speaker, he is making things worse. Everyone is unhappy. Isn't it a good thing that the Chancellor is an expert at customer complaints?
Mr. Speaker, I think she's just read out the charge sheet against the last government. Everything is broken. And they come here every week with absolutely nothing to offer except complaints. Nothing constructive, no new ideas. They don't know what they're doing from one day to the next. Living in this fantasy world that everything was fine, apparently, for 14 years. Well, the country's fed up with those fantasies. They've got rid of those fantasies. We're going to take the hard decisions. They're jumping on every bandwagon that's passing. We're taking the country forward.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we enter the last week of Islamophobia Awareness Month, the Prime Minister will know that this year has been an extraordinarily difficult for British Muslims on the receiving end of society's most deplorable attitudes, considered easy prey for the far right and scapegoated by politicians endorsing institutional Islamophobia. And the reality is this emboldening and normalisation of Islamophobia, as highlighted in a number of reports, led to the race riots we saw on the streets of Britain this summer, where mosques and those who are visibly Muslim were subject to despicable attacks, with many left fearing for their lives. So will the Prime Minister condemn those in public office and positions of power who actively promote Islamophobia? Will he commit to adopting a definition today? And will he further outline what concrete steps the government is taking to rip out Islamophobia at its roots, including in this place?
Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise Islamophobia, and there's been a concerning rise in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism over recent months, and we are committed to tackling all forms of hatred, and we will work with others on an ongoing basis to make sure that we do. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks about the terrible impact of Storm Bert with all the flooding? Our thoughts are with all those affected, with thanks to our amazing emergency services. Mr. Speaker, Christine's father was told that he needed end-of-life care, but after a few days it was removed due to funding cuts. He was told that he wouldn't get it, and he died a few weeks later in excruciating pain. Christine said it was terrible to watch him suffer. Does the Prime Minister agree that whatever the House decides on Friday, it is urgent to improve access to high-quality end-of-life care? And will he make that a key focus of the 10-year NHS plan? And will he commit now to protect hospices from the national insurance rise?
I thank you for raising that case, and I think the thoughts of the whole House with the family involved. And, Mr. Speaker, obviously there's a very important vote on Friday, but whichever way that vote goes, we must invest properly in care across our health service, and that's why, in addition to putting the NHS back on its feet, we're putting forward a 10-year plan to make sure the NHS can give the care that everybody would expect across the spectrum, including end-of-life care.
So, Ed David. Can I thank the Prime Minister for that reply, and I hope we'll hear more from ministers, particularly on hospices and national insurance, in days to come. Turning to the cost of living crisis, on Friday, Ofgem said that in January, energy bills would go up again after last month's 10% rise. Millions of people are really worried about how they're going to make ends meet this winter, not least hundreds of thousands of pensioners who are in poverty but above the pension credit limit, who will now lose winter fuel payments. So with energy bills going up again, will the Prime Minister reconsider and restore winter fuel payments?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the whole House is concerned about energy bills, which are actually lower this year than they were last year. The long-term way to deal with this is clean power by 2030, to make sure we drive those energy bills down on a permanent basis. And that's what we will do. On the winter fuel allowance, he knows very well what the government's position is, and I've rehearsed it, indeed, with him many times.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Antisocial behaviour involving modified and off-road bikes is a menace that has a huge impact on communities like mine in Sunderland. While I welcome the work Northumbria Police do in partnership with our council on this issue, they need stronger powers and more resources. Can the Prime Minister outline how he will back the police to tackle the misery caused by intimidating and downright dangerous antisocial behaviour on bikes?
Well, I thank him for raising this, because antisocial behaviour affects so many people. Sometimes it's described to me as low level. It isn't in the impact it has, particularly when it comes to off-road bikes. And that's why we're implementing tough new respect orders, which will give powers to the police, including powers to seize off-road bikes, but crucially adds a power of arrest for breach of the orders, something that's been missing in recent years. So we will tackle this because it blights communities across the country.
Stephen Flynn. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As everyone in the House will be aware, we're currently in the middle of BBC Anti-Scam Awareness Week. And of course, the advice in that context is always simple. If you see a scam, you should report it. So with that in mind, can the Prime Minister advise the House? Is he aware of anyone who's promised to reduce energy bills only for them to increase? Is he aware of anyone who promised to back business only to tax business? And is he aware of anyone who promised to protect pensioners only to pick their pockets for their winter fuel allowance?
Well, it's very good to see.
Sorry. The gallery will not clap and not interrupt the proceedings. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad to see him in his seat in this House, as I'm sure many of his colleagues in Scotland share that sentiment. What I can point to is a government in Scotland that promised to take Scotland forward and took them backwards. So I can identify the first one. It's right there.
Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. November marks Islamophobia Awareness Month. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
Can I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House? We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sarah and her family have farmed beef and cattle in my Gordon and Buchan constituency for over 70 years, and they'd always planned for her sister to continue the family legacy. Earlier this year, Sarah's mother died very suddenly and unexpectedly, and she was just 58. Sarah said to me that despite already having a tragic year, it was made even worse after the budget, saying that changes to agricultural property relief has hit us hard when we're already struggling with bereavement and trying to cope with losing mum. What would the Prime Minister say to Sarah and her family on what has been the most difficult year of their lives, in light as well of the family farm tax?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to her for raising the case and the awful bereavement. And if she would kindly send me the details of the case, then I'll certainly have a look at it. In relation to farming more broadly, as she knows, £5 billion was set aside in the budget over the next 2 years as an investment in farming. That's the biggest amount that's ever been set aside. I hear the chuntering, but they actually failed to spend the last farming budget by £300 million. On the question of inheritance and family farms, obviously it's important to bear in mind in a typical case, which is parents passing to a child, the threshold is £3 million, and that is why, as she knows, the vast majority of farms will be totally unaffected.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Southwark faces a significant challenge of antisocial behaviour, but fewer police today than in 2010 due to Tory cuts in coalition with the Lib Dems. As the Prime Minister fixes the postcode lottery and law and order, will he consider the request from Southwark Police, Southwark Council and myself for our community to be a pilot test area for the new respect orders to address this serious problem?
Well, I'm grateful for him for raising this because public has been badly eroded under the last government, and we will drive that up with a major programme of reform. That includes recruiting 13,000 more police into neighbourhood policing and the tough new respect orders, coupled with the power to arrest for breach of the order.
Rupert Nell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I sincerely hope that all of us in this House agree that good government is transparent government. In response to my written question on publishing the number of foreign nationals receiving universal credit, I was informed by a Department of Work and Pensions Minister that the feasibility of developing suitable official statistics was being examined. Will the Prime Minister today commit to using his good offices to publish this data transparently?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this, and I know there's been an exchange on it, and as soon as I've got an update for him, I will provide that for him so that he's got it. Thank you.
Waverley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within weeks of a Labour government, the government delivered for the mine workers in the mine workers pension scheme. It was so well received and it was justice done. However, is it not time to seek the truth with regards to the policing during the miners' strike? And would the Prime Minister commit to an early and full inquiry into the policing during the miners' strike, something which this lot denied for generations?
Well, I'm grateful for him for raising this. That question of the mine workers' pension scheme reversed a historic injustice, and I was so pleased we were able to do that in the budget. In relation to the miners' strike, as I think he knows, I've met some of the Orgreave campaigners and listened very carefully to what they say. They are entitled to the truth, and we're thinking carefully about what the next step should be in order to deliver that for them.
Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next month marks 2 years since the death
of Cody Fisher, a young man from my constituency of Stratford-on-Avon. Cody was a talented footballer with a bright future whose life was tragically cut short when he was stabbed in a nightclub in Birmingham. His mother, Tracy, has been campaigning tirelessly in his memory for legislation which would require venues to wear bleed kits and metal detectors. In the light of the government's commitment to tackling knife crime, will the Prime Minister meet with Tracy and me to discuss these vital proposals to better protect young people like Cody from the devastating impact of knife crime?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for raising the tragic case and pay tribute to Tracy for her campaigning. I've met a number of families on this issue of bleed kits, so I know firsthand just how important it is. We are taking measures in relation to knife crime, which includes banning the sale of online knives, making them less available, of course to take young people out of offending where we can, and real penalties. But I am happy to look at bleed kits, and I will make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to hear more of what we're doing, but also to make her case.
Rachel Hopkins.
Mr Speaker, and I refer to my register of interests. The proposed closure of Luton's Vauxhall van plant by Stellantis is devastating news for our town.
Yeah.
Over 1,000 jobs at risk and the future prosperity of our town threatened. So can the Prime Minister assure me there will be cross-departmental response to support the automotive sector, but importantly, good skilled jobs in Luton?
Yes, I will, and I know and thank her for raising this, because it is a difficult and uncertain time for workers in Luton and her constituents and their families. And that's why we're working with the industry. There will in fact be a statement later on today, Mr Speaker, about this. It's important we do whatever we can to support these communities.
Then Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tenbury Wells was flooded again with Storm Bert last weekend, the second time the town has been flooded this year, and it's a town where it's only a case of when, not if, it will flood again. And the situation is made even more devastating for residents because there is a fully developed flood defence plan that is partly funded for the town. And the budget carried forward £2.4 billion for flood defences. Can the Prime Minister commit to be able to use his offices to finally get this scheme built and to fix the foundations of Tenbury Wells?
Well, I'm grateful to her for raising this, which is an awful situation for her constituents. We all know how devastating flooding is, the initial damage that it caused, but then the ongoing damage, including problems then of insurance, etc., that then prevail for many, many years. We are committed to tackling this. That's why we set aside the money that we did in the budget, and I'll happily arrange for her to have a meeting with the relevant minister to look at the particular details of her case. But I thank her for raising it, because I do know for her constituents it's such an important issue.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last weekend in Cwmtaleiri, torrential rain caused a landslip. Slurry, even boulders, poured down streets. People were afraid. The Chancellor just agreed a welcome £25 million for coal tip movements in Wales. Given the impact of extreme weather events, will the Prime Minister continue to prioritise coal tips to keep our communities safe?
Yes, I will, and I know how much of a concern it is to his constituents. Indeed, we went together to meet some of those constituents last time there was terrible flooding, but that commitment to the £25 million in relation to coal tips is very important. And what I would say on flooding, we've now had two questions on this. If other members of the House do have individual issues they're not able to raise here, if they get in touch with myself or my office, I'll make sure that they get whatever they need in support of their constituents.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and of course we too welcome the ceasefire in Lebanon. But now that arrest warrants have been issued for his allies, Netanyahu and Gallant, the Prime Minister's determination to supply Israel with the weapons it requires to carry out its atrocities in Gaza, which has always been morally repugnant, is now completely untenable. But what these warrants would do is present him with a perfectly valid legal avenue by which he can end the UK's complicity in this slaughter. So will he do that, or will the Prime Minister continue to choose to licence F-35 components to a regime which is now led by a man wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity?
We've set out our position under the current law, as he well knows. I've set out my position very, very clearly in relation to the sale of capability to Israel to defend itself against attacks such as those from Iran. And I'm very clear that we'll continue to do so.
Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Derby City Centre is turning the page on 14 years of Conservative decline. With a new performance venue, a new business school and restored market hall. But across the country we see too many empty shops and quiet high streets. This budget is putting more money into the pockets of working people to spend supporting local businesses. Will the Prime Minister commit, contrary to Conservative scaremongering, to support and protect small businesses that are the beating heart of our high streets?
They can chunt her all they like. She's describing their legacy. She's describing their legacy. We are turning that around. We're supporting small businesses. We're supporting the high street. We're rebuilding our country as they go backwards.
David Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Exmouth and Exeter East and our neighbours across the South West are understandably concerned about the rail disruption and potential economic damage that the HS2 construction at Old Oak Common will cause to our region for at least the next 7 years. So will the Prime Minister please commit to producing a full mitigation plan as soon as possible to address these issues and to ensure that the South West does not lose out?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to him for raising the issue, which is of real importance to his constituents, and we have committed £30 million to mitigate the impact of the construction at Old Oak Common. Local services will be unaffected, and current plans will see services run between Exeter and London Euston. But I'm very happy again to arrange a meeting with the relevant minister if he wants that, in order to follow up on the particular concern of his constituents.
Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 14 years of the Tories, our criminal justice system is on its knees, leaving just 4.4 of domestic assault cases recorded by the police, resulting in a conviction. With Monday just gone being the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, can the Prime Minister tell us what he's going to do to ensure the criminal justice system works for women and girls in North West Leicestershire and beyond?
Well, she's right to say the criminal justice system was broken by the last government, like everything else that they touched in the 14 years. Mr. Speaker, we take this extremely seriously. We've made a commitment to halving violence against women and girls. We're taking a number of measures in relation to that, piloting, for example, domestic abuse protection orders and making it clear we will introduce a standalone offence of spiking. These are some of the measures which, frankly, we ought to be able to work across the House on, because the issue is of such importance.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ukraine faces a hell of a battle on its eastern front with Russia, but on the home front, the challenge is just as great. Just facing a harsh winter, just last week it was reported that 80% of its energy infrastructure is either damaged or destroyed. They desperately need power generators and associated equipment. So will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me to discuss the provision of energy aid to this important ally, Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have provided support. This is a very serious issue, £370 million of support to the energy sector in Ukraine, which is being targeted by the Russian strikes. I will ensure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister, and I'm pleased that on this issue there is unity across the House in our defence of Ukraine in the face of Russia's aggression.
Alex Brewer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After years of neglect under the previous Conservative government, GP surgeries and across North East Hampshire, Russia, they are preparing now for huge bills to pay increased employer national insurance contributions. Heart Health Partnership in Fleet estimates this will cost them 3 nursing salaries and have already reduced staff hours by 50 per week, with more cuts in January. Can the Prime Minister please tell GPs in my constituency which patient services they should cut in order to pay the bills?
Mr. Speaker, she's absolutely right that the NHS was broken by the last administration. And the Darcy report makes that absolute. They should hang their heads in shame, frankly. We are providing in the budget £22 billion of additional funding this year for our NHS. That's a huge investment in our NHS, which is much welcomed across the NHS, much needed across the NHS. We will, of course, work with GPs and consult the sector on the services they provide and the money that they're entitled to in return. And all of that funding will be confirmed in the usual way.
Johnny Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We recognise that Labour is determined to defend the economically disastrous Conservative policies of being outside the customs union and single market. However, does the Prime Minister agree with the principle that where it is in our country's interest to maintain alignment with EU standards so we can better sell our products internationally, we align, and where it is in our interest to diverge, we diverge?
I certainly agree that the deal we got under the last government is not the best deal that we can get, and that's why we're determined to reset the relationship, which we have already begun. Obviously, there'll be no return to freedom of movement, the customs union or the single market, but beyond that, we can increase, I think, and improve the situation, whether it comes to trading, to security and other cooperation, and we're actively working on that.
Final question, Frank McNally.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Following a major fire at the Tradebay depot in my constituency in 2021, Scotland's clinical waste was forced to be transported to England due to a complete lack of forward planning. Tradebay was only appointed after the previous contractor collapsed, leaving human remains languishing in a warehouse. And it's now been revealed that the Spanish company was bailed out with £5.4 million of taxpayers' money. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the SNP government has consistently failed to get a grip of clinical waste disposal and must act appropriately to protect the public purse and ensure public safety?
Well, I do agree with that, and it's not. It's the rule rather than exception when it comes to the SNP government. And the challenge for them now is they've got the powers to act. They've now been given the money to act. They've run out of excuses.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. We'll let the front benches change over. Right, we now come to the statement. Secretary of State for Business, Jonathan Reynolds.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement. Can I begin by saying I know yesterday was a dark day for Luton. This is an iconic plant, powered by a talented workforce, and there are very few people in the town who don't know someone who works at the site. I want to outline the steps the government has taken to try and prevent this outcome and how we're going to support the industry and the area going forward. Mr. Speaker, the Transport Secretary and I found out about the challenges at this site just 10 days after the election. The global CEO told us he felt extremely frustrated by the lack of action from the previous government, which meant his desire was to close the Luton plant. Since then, we have been involved in intense negotiations with the company to try and find a way to keep the site open. Following these initial meetings, in July of this year, the company announced its intention to conduct a review of its operations in response to the significant pressures they were facing in key markets. Following the review, the company set out plans on Tuesday, which will see manufacturing at the 2 current Stellantis plants consolidated into a single location. We were, and are, aware that Stellantis has significant excess capacity across Europe. The company's talk of efficiency and investment elsewhere will, of course, be positive for their bottom line, but it will come as no comfort to the workers affected. For over a century, Vauxhall as a brand has been synonymous with Luton, and we are bitterly disappointed to hear that this relationship looks likely to end. Our number one priority is the people of Luton, who will, of course, be devastated by this decision. News like this rips through the heart of communities, sending shockwaves beyond those immediately impacted, through their families, their communities, and the businesses they support. I myself grew up in a car community, and I know what it is like when half the street work at the same site. We have asked the company to urgently share their full plans with us and to work with the government so that every single worker who is impacted receives the support they deserve. The Department for Work and Pensions stands ready to help anyone affected with the rapid response service designed exactly for these kinds of scenarios. It provides vital support and advice to both employers and their employees facing redundancy. I want the House to be aware that we have done everything we possibly can to prevent this closure from happening. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, and I met Stellantis many times over the summer and again on Tuesday morning to discuss the situation and the acute pressures the company is facing. We've worked hard to find a solution that would support the business and ensure people kept their jobs, and we confirmed in writing we were willing to consider any solution put forward. However, despite our best efforts, we have been forced to accept that this is ultimately a commercial decision by Stellantis as they respond to wider challenges within the sector. And I'll be frank with honourable members. These challenges are not confined to any one company. Car manufacturers around the world are battling with increased costs, supply chain issues, and changing consumer demand in a highly competitive, fast-evolving market. Honourable members will know that last week, Ford also announced 800 job losses in the UK over the next 3 years as part of a major restructuring programme across the whole of Europe. Many of the challenges faced by our car manufacturers are global in nature, and they cannot be resolved by UK government intervention alone. And whilst this announcement is not what we wanted, nor what we worked towards, we must not mischaracterise this. It categorically does not signal a retreat by Stellantis from the UK. The plans announced by the company will also see them investing £50 million as they consolidate manufacturing at their Ellesmere Port plant in Cheshire. Honourable members will know that Ellesmere Port is the UK's first all-battery electric vehicle plant, and Stellantis' decision to bring production of the Vivaro electric van to there is welcome. We will, of course, continue to work closely with the company on next steps of the consolidation process, including the proposal to offer affected workers a relocation package to take up roles at Ellesmere Port. The investments being made at Ellesmere Port and elsewhere demonstrate that there are real opportunities for UK manufacturing as part of the move to zero-emission vehicles. But this transition has to be properly managed, and it requires a government that's on the pitch, something the car industry finally now has in this government. The government is determined to support automotive companies as they revamp their production lines, adjust their business plans, and develop the technology needed for the next generation of zero-emission vehicles. These cars and vans are greener, they're cleaner, and they're essential to our net zero ambitions. Roughly 30% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions come from cars, vans and lorries. To tackle this and wean our country off imported fossil fuels, we do need emission vehicles. But this government is resolute that this transition must be done in partnership between government, industry and, of course, consumers. And that is why my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, and I are listening closely to the concerns of the automotive industry and the wider sector about the transition to electric vehicles and the Conservative Party's zero-emission vehicle mandate. We held a roundtable earlier this month to hear directly from major automotive companies, from the SMMT and the charging sector. And in response, we will be shortly fast-tracking a consultation on our manifesto commitment to end the sales of new purely petrol and diesel cars by 2030. But we will use that consultation to engage with industry on the previous government's ZEV transition mandate and the flexibilities contained within it, and we will welcome on board their feedback as we move forwards. We want to do everything we can, together with industry, to secure further investment into the British automotive sector now and over the long term. It is why in the budget the Chancellor committed £2 billion in R&D and capital funding to support the zero-emissions vehicle manufacturing sector and supply chain. And our industrial strategy will also give the automotive sector the certainty it deserves and send a clear signal to global boardrooms that this government is in this for the long term. We want to invest alongside them, create a policy environment that allows them to prosper and help them do what they do best, bringing good jobs to every part of this country. And through the National Wealth Fund, we're unlocking billions in private investment to invest in new green infrastructure, including gigafactories, supporting growth and job creation, not just in the automotive sector, but in the wider economy too. And we're working with investors to build a globally competitive electric vehicle supply chain in the UK, laying the foundations for growth over the long term. Mr. Speaker, the closure of the Luton plant by Stellantis is a bitter blow to our car industry, to Luton and to the workers who made Vauxhall a world-class brand producing world-class cars and vans. But we must not lose sight of the fact that these vehicles will continue to be designed and built here in the UK at Ellesmere Port. And that matters to me and it matters to the government. When I say decarbonisation must not mean deindustrialisation, I mean it. Winning the race to net zero and having a world-leading automotive sector must go hand in hand. We must never undermine the transition as the previous government did, but we will be pragmatic on ensuring regulation and incentives are working as they should. Contrived culture wars are not what this industry needs. Instead, it needs a partner in government ready to look at the practical solutions necessary, and we stand ready to do that. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. This is a sad day for the 1,100 workers at the Luton Vauxhall factory, and our thoughts are first and foremost with them and their families. They are the most recent custodians in a long history that goes back to 1905, when their factory opened the doors for the first time. Luton-built white vans are icons of British business, representing to many the hard graft and skill of millions of traders, the self-employed and small businesses across this country. Mr. Speaker, we on these benches stand by these hard-working people. We're on the side of the plant's workers because we know the value of skilled work and the transformative power of British business. The closure of the Luton plant, I fear, is just a down payment on jobs that will be lost under this government's relentless attacks on industry, its neglect of the realities of business, and its failure to meet its promise not to raise taxes. The government owes it to the plant's workers to at least be honest. This decision is the direct result of a government policy that is simply unworkable for industry. Stellantis told us as much when they said that this decision was made in the context of the zero emissions mandate. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders has said that the UK situation is particularly acute, with arguably the toughest targets and most accelerated timeline on the world. And there are unsustainable business costs undermining UK industry. The government's policy on zero-emission vehicles is a jobs killer. They say they've been talking since July. So why today, Mr. Speaker, this panicked U-turn when it's already too late? Under the last government, we acknowledged that the previous vehicle mandate was too stringent. We took the decision to push this back, recognising the impact that it would have on industry. We listened to Unite the Union on this. His party unilaterally reversed those changes and brought the deadline forward to 2030. Instead of Unite, he listened to the member for Climate Central in Doncaster North. But even today, the Secretary of State speaks of ending the sale of new purely petrol and diesel cars by 2030. He's tried to slip a subtle change in there, the consequences of which are significant. And whilst I welcome that for once this government has listened to business, he appears to be misleading them at the same time. Can he explain exactly what his policy is? There are real costs, as we see today, to these targets. And instead of having the courage to stand up and recognise that he was wrong, his solution appears to be yet another consultation which is yet to take place. How many automotive businesses has the Secretary of State spoken to about these targets? And in any of his conversations with Stellantis, did they ask him at any point to remove the fines on their business? Has he met with the Right Honourable Member for Doncaster to entreat him to row back from his ideological pursuit of domestic targets, ignoring the fact that they are exporting jobs, exporting British jobs, Mr. Speaker, to more carbon-intense economies? But most of all, we mustn't ignore the elephant in the room about the timing of this decision. This follows a budget that has declared war on business, a triple whammy of tax rises that removes incentives for growth and investment, a 25 billion jobs tax, which has left boardrooms across the country putting recruitment and pay rises on hold, and alongside an employment rights bill written hand in hand with his union paymasters that's already deterring businesses from hiring in Britain. Businesses are ringing the alarm bells. The CBI, the British Retail Consortium, UK Hospitality and the Society of Motor Manufacturers have all said the pressures on business are too much to swallow. Open letter after open letter, statement after statement, Labour are not on their side. They lied about their plans. They're attacking working people, and now they're attacking the vans they go to work in. The businessmen and women who gave Labour the benefit of the doubt are regretting it. When will the Secretary of State listen? When will his government abandon its attack on British business? Will he lead the charge to change course? And why won't he suspend the fines and targets which have led to today's tragedy?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, that is the single most dishonest statement I've ever heard in the time in this House.
I'm sure the honourable gentleman will be withdrawing that comment.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to clarify some of the points the honourable gentleman raised on the other bench. The ZEV mandate policy is a...
We're on the same side. We'll be quiet, won't we? Secretary of State.
The ZEV mandate policy, the Shadow Minister mentioned, is a policy of the previous government, of which he is aware. The changes the previous government made were not to the ZEV mandate. They were not pragmatic on it. They changed the destination and kept the fines and the ramp-up and the thresholds exactly the same. So what they did was give no flexibility or pragmatism in how that policy operated, but still undermined the transition, leading to a massive reduction in consumer confidence. And he asks, has the honourable gentleman talked to industry? I was the guest speaker at the SMMT dinner last night. 1,000 people there from every bit of the automotive sector. They are absolutely clear that it's the destination they support. It's the Conservative government, the previous Conservative government's policy as to how this operates, which is causing them the problems. And as I said in the statement, if he was listening, or if he'd read it in advance, 10 days in to this government, we were told this plant was likely to close. It is on this side of the House that we've acted with pragmatism, been willing to look at any part of this policy in order to make sure this outcome didn't happen. The simple truth was that it was too late after 14 years of failure to be able to put this right. So I just have to say to him, with all politeness, he is out of touch with industry, he is out of touch with workers, he's even out of touch with what the previous Conservative government did, and I think that speaks for itself.
Chair of the Select Committee, Liam Burns.
This is indeed a hard day for Luton, and I welcome what the Secretary of State had to share with the House today, and I welcome the review that he's announced of the zero-emission mandate. As part of that review, I do hope that he looks again at the perversities of the regime that he inherited that could involve makers of petrol engines in this country transferring credits to companies like Elon Musk's Tesla and Chinese EV makers. But if we really want to make sure that there is a level playing field, Mr. Speaker, why don't we reverse the decision of the last Secretary of State, follow the EU Commission and launch anti-subsidy investigations into Chinese EV makers? The Trade Remedy Authority is ready to go. It just needs the Secretary of State to give the green light.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee and indeed for our exchanges we had in the committee evidence session yesterday. He is right to say that what we have inherited is a position where how the policy operates, the flexibilities that are contained within it, and the fact that no domestic producer is on track means effectively the transfer he has described is the problem. That is when I say decarbonisation cannot mean deindustrialisation. It is precisely that we've inherited that we are critiquing. Now, we don't want to undermine the transition in the way the previous Prime Minister did, because anyone in industry in this sector will be able to tell honourable members opposite how disastrous that was. But what we need to give is breathing space and making sure that that policy is operating in a way which doesn't have any of the kind of perverse incentives he's described. Now, on the subsidies point and the trade remedies and the potential response from the UK, we've got to bear in mind two things. First of all, the system we've inherited is industry itself, which makes the application for that. I do have powers as Secretary of State to do that, though they've never been used to my knowledge. But we must also remember that the UK automotive sector is a world-class export-led sector. If we were to go in any kind of protectionist route on principle, we've got to bear in mind what it would mean for the markets we sell those vehicles into. If you sell 80% of your product abroad, it is the international export position you've got to consider alongside the domestic market. But I say again, if industry makes that request, of course it would be followed in accordance with the way the system operates.
Clive Jones, the Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for the advance copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I also attended the Society of Motor Manufacturer and Traders annual dinner, same as the Secretary of State, and greatly appreciated the opportunity to hear directly from a sector that is so important to the British economy. UK car manufacturing brings billions of pounds into our economy and employ hundreds of thousands of people directly and many more thousands of people across their supply chain. They are at the forefront of the green transition and in making transport sustainable for the future via electric vehicles. And most importantly, they are always willing to be frank with me and other politicians because they reaffirm to me that the industry sees major hurdles on the horizon. And the closure of Vauxhall's 100-year-old factory in Luton is a sign of great troubles ahead. Inevitably, the Conservatives are going to play politics with this announcement, but there is still no apology from them for trashing the economy. There is not one moment of reflection that the previous government's policy on electric vehicles was a disaster. It simply did not do enough on infrastructure and incentives, and therefore the government need to fix the Tories' mess. As a starting point, the government urgently need to work with Vauxhall to mitigate what will be a major shock for this area. The government have said that it will fast-track a consultation, but that needs to be fast-tracked today. Mr. Speaker, urgency is the key. When will the consultation start, and when does the Minister expect it to report? The previous government did not do enough to incentivise people to buy electric vehicles, nor did it provide the right infrastructure. What is the government doing to increase sales of electric vehicles and to increase the number of charging points in places like my constituency of Wokingham?
Seriously.
I'm grateful to him for his questions and his observations, and apologies. He's had to hear me speak twice on this in the short passage of time from last night till today. But he asks the Conservative Party to apologise for their economic record. That case stands for itself. But I would also like to know, given how urgently this was presented to us as a new government, what they were doing at the end of the last government. What did they know? What conversations were they aware of? Because certainly what we inherited was a position of extreme frustration from the company. I can't imagine that hadn't been conveyed in some way to our predecessors. There were policies in terms of specific questions in the budget around charging infrastructure. I recognise that's a key part of this, as well as the £2 billion for the R&D, Automotive Transformation Fund, and the partnership with business that we use that for. He asks on the consultation, obviously that will come from the Department of Transport. Shadow Secretary of State asked about why that's a consultation. Well, the previous government set these policies in primary legislation, so he knows there are processes to follow in order to do that. Any conversation about the thresholds and the existing policy, that is for my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport. But I go back to this point about how the system works, the flexibilities, the allowances, how we can make sure that we are giving automotive manufacturers in the UK a system that lets them get to the transition they want and the consumer wants, but does it in a way which works with industry to enable that transition to happen for the benefit of the United Kingdom.
Rachel Hopkins.
I'm grateful again, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my register of interest as a trade union member and also someone with friends who have heard that they've lost their jobs. Closing the Luton site will damage our local economy with 600 jobs at risk, more in the supply chain, and workers and families receiving this devastating news just before Christmas. I welcome the comments from the Secretary of State saying decarbonisation must not mean deindustrialisation and the decimation of good, skilled jobs. Will his announcement today move the dial in discussions with Stellantis to help protect the Luton site? And I welcome his tone of taking this seriously compared to members opposite. So will he join me in visiting workers and their trade union representatives at the Luton site to listen to their concerns?
Secretary of State. Extremely grateful to my honourable friend for her question, and I believe everyone in the House who cares about the automotive sector and working people in this country will share the sentiments that she has put forward about the scale of what this will mean for Luton. I can absolutely promise her, yes, I'll take up her invitation to come with her to the site. I can also promise her the full deployment of my department and indeed all of my colleagues across government to whatever help is required. We are in conversations with Stellantis, as the union are, I believe, about the details of the package that will be presented to the workforce, but of course I'll engage closely with her and her honourable friend for the other side of Luton in order to make sure that it's to the maximum benefit of her constituents in the wider area.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a Bedfordshire MP, I know how significant the Vauxhall plant is to our local economy and as a local employer. The Minister has explained how devastating this will be for families locally, not just in Luton but also in my constituency in mid-Bedfordshire. But the Minister unfortunately has said very little about how he's going to support the people that are losing their jobs. Is the Minister concerned that this government's tax on jobs will make it much more difficult to replace the 1,000 manufacturing jobs in Bedfordshire?
Grateful to him for his sentiments, but the straightforward answer to that question is no. This is a skilled and talented workforce. They haven't lost their jobs because of any deficiencies on their part. They have been in a position where the combination of the overcapacity in Europe, I mean, I'll be frank, I believe from the minute we came to office, I think this closure was already what the company intended and has nothing to do whatsoever with government policy. I recognise the pressures on the existing policy we've inherited, hence the pragmatism on our part as a government to make sure that's working for the transition. But I have absolutely no doubt whether these workers choose to take advantage of the relocation offer or are in demand elsewhere. They're brilliant, talented people who will be in demand.
Sarah Owen.
Mr. Speaker, may I refer members to my register of interests. Before I start, I want to put on record that the 1,100 people that will be losing their jobs in Luton today deserved much better than the response from the Conservative front bench. It was very far from factual and it was very far from serious. I thank the Secretary of State for their statement and welcome any support for Vauxhall workers and their families who are understandably devastated by Stellantis' decision, especially this close to Christmas. This follows the closure of the Skeff plant in Luton North after a century of manufacturing earlier this year. Like them, Vauxhall is, or was, synonymous with Luton. Stellantis' callous decision will impact our whole town, our whole region even. So what support will be offered to not just the skilled and dedicated Vauxhall workers who are losing their jobs, but also to our whole town as a whole to cope with the loss of this manufacturing giant which Luton helped build?
Sir State.
Grateful to my honourable friend for her question as well, and echo the sentiments I gave to her constituency neighbour in my earlier question. The timing of this, I think, the whole decision is regrettable, but the timing is particularly regrettable around it. As I said in my statement, we've done everything we can since the new government came into power on the 5th of July to try to avoid this. I reiterated the offers I had made throughout the negotiating process in terms of both policy flexibility and indeed the potential of new government investment in the site, but regrettably it was not possible to change this decision. The support that I have made clear is available. I reiterate that promise, and I do say, despite in fact I would not want to minimise the impact of this in any way. I believe her area is a place of considerable economic strength, firms in engineering and aerospace, in air travel, in the creative industries. There's a lot to be optimistic about for the future, but that doesn't take away the bitterness of this particular blow for Luton at this time. I recognise that.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I make clear that we on this side regard this as a very grave matter? We are taking this seriously, and we are also dealing in facts. Yep. Turning then to veracity, can we hear whether or not Stellantis raised the question of the eye-watering ZEV mandate fines? Did they ask for them to be lifted?
I'm grateful to him for his question. Yes, in the conversations we had with them, they raised every aspect of the previous government's policy in terms of the flexibilities, the ability to cap and trade, some of those allowances, what it would mean for the bottom line. And I take those concerns seriously. That's why I'm willing, in a way that does not undermine the destination, to consult on how this policy works alongside my colleague, the Secretary of State for Transport. Because whilst I feel the previous government's aspiration, I understand why they did this policy, I don't think they considered, when the decision was made, the kind of falling demand in Europe which we have seen. And I think we have to work pragmatically across all bits of government to make sure this policy is not having the kind of outcomes which I think many of us who are aware of how exactly this works do share.
Matt Weston.
Mr. Speaker, I refer members to my declaration of interest. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement. I'm greatly saddened by the decision, and may I suggest that plant rationalisation, platform rationalisation would have been a major factor. Let's be honest, the industry wanted certainty, but the challenge faced by automotive manufacturers in meeting the ZEV mandate, introduced by the last government, is more stringent than in Europe and most other markets. Put simply, consumer uncertainty was introduced by the last government. So I find the remarks of the Shadow Minister disingenuous. Can I urge the government to introduce more flexibility in the annual targets?
Disingenuous is aimed at a particular person. We don't do that. You've been here long enough, and I'm sure you want to withdraw it immediately.
I withdraw that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Can I urge the government to introduce more flexibility in the annual targets 24 to 29, introduce consumer incentives, and consider redirecting any penalties towards EV charging infrastructure and not to Chinese government car companies?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend as well. I think he makes some very good points about the fact that whilst nearly every major market has policies of this kind, ours does operate in a different way, say to, for instance, how the French proceeded with theirs. I agree with him that the major failing of the former Prime Minister's speech was to keep this policy in place but change the destination, which really makes no coherence whatsoever. You should do one or the other logically. To do both undermines confidence and still doesn't give the kind of pragmatic flexibilities we're talking about today. And the specific things that he mentioned will all be part of the consultation my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, will lead on.
Sir Julian.
I assure the Secretary of State that the question I'm about to ask I would have put to a Conservative minister equally. And that is this. If all British car manufacturers came together and told the government that they could not possibly meet this 2030 goal, would the government nevertheless persevere in maintaining it as an immovable target?
Well, I would recognise the honourable gentleman's fairness and equity, whichever side of the House he's sitting on, and have no doubts about that. We do listen to industry. We have that very close relationship with them, and that is why we understand that the destination they want is 2030. The pressures of the system are in the next few years because of a situation which I don't believe, and I'm saying this in good faith to Conservative members, I don't believe government ministers at the time considered this set of European and global economic factors in terms of the particular decisions that they made. So that's why we've got to get this balance right. We should also recognise, given we are an export-led automotive producer, that if we weren't being ambitious about the transition, we'd lose our export markets because we wouldn't have anything to sell because other countries have these policies, and that is where the consumer is going. It's about how we support the transition, and that's where we work so closely with industry.
Antonio Batts.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw attention to the Register of Interests as a member of Unite the Union. Can I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House today on such a difficult day for the car industry. All of our thoughts are with the workers in Luton today. I wanted to ask the Secretary of State to thank him for the work he's doing, engaging with the industry and with unions on a better way forward on electric vehicle targets. This news is really disappointing, but does the Secretary of State agree with me that we can and should be positive about the future of the automotive industry in this country? It matters to me locally as the MP for many, many businesses in the automotive supply chain, as I know it matters to many members across the House.
I thoroughly agree with the content and sentiment of my honourable friend's question. That support this government is committed to is about that transition, but we should be excited by what British manufacturers are doing. We should be excited by what JLR, what Nissan, what Toyota are doing. We should be excited, I mean, in the supercar, the luxury end of the market from McLaren and Rolls-Royce. I could mention all of our iconic brands. There's a lot of exciting things going on. And if honourable members aren't aware of that, these are all manufacturers more than happy to host members of Parliament coming to visit. So I would encourage people who aren't aware of the situation to do that. But they will explain the pressures they're under in the short term, and they will endorse the change of policy this government is putting forward today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Electric Vehicles Association say that 14 NGOs, think tanks and campaign groups are advocating to uphold the ZEV mandate. We have just seen the most devastating storms, dangerously accelerated by climate change. I know the government knows that net zero is not negotiable. The previous government has persistently undermined the motor manufacturing industry. Will this government listen to the Electric Vehicle Association, who are, after all, supporting this government in its ambition to get to net zero?
Mr. Speaker, I genuinely appreciate the question from the other perspective, if you like, to this, because it's not just NGOs, there's a big business element that we've been in close contact with about charging infrastructure, and I understand that. And I just want to make clear, that is why we are not undermining the transition. That's why we are ambitious with industry for where we get to. Nothing we are going to propose as a government will itself reduce or limit the deployment of electric vehicles. What I'm talking about, what we are talking about as a government, is looking at how the flexibilities, for instance, in the system operate. So we are doing everything we can alongside industry to get to that destination. So I want nothing to do with the approach from the previous government, which did have a really detrimental effect on the industry, and they will tell any honourable member that very clearly. But I'm listening to what it means to have this, frankly, change in economic circumstances in terms of demand, private demand for electric vehicles, and want to work with industry to get to the place of the destination I think we both strongly support.
Bill Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous government were warned, including multiple times in this chamber, about the damage they were doing to the car industry before the election. The constant changes of policy on net zero, the missing of targets on the rollout of charge points, the failure to even allocate the rapid charge fund, all of these undermined consumer confidence. So can I ask my right honourable friend to make sure that after his review, and as soon as possible, he balances up the needs of manufacturers of cars and vans with the needs of consumers?
I believe the analysis of my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think he and I were in the chamber several occasions where this case was made to the previous government. I mean, look, the intervention from the former Prime Minister was not based in any kind of business or economic logic. It was an attempt to create some sort of wedge issue before the election, which frankly did them absolutely no good because people saw straight through it. I say again, to change the deadline but keep the existing thresholds in place up until 2030 was the worst of all worlds. It did have a really negative impact on consumer confidence, excuse me, and we will never repeat those mistakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has said in his statement that at the time of the election, Stellantis were minded to close the plant. But since the election, we've had the budget, which has imposed £25 billion of increased taxes on business. We've had the Employment Rights Bill, which is going to increase costs on business enormously as well. And both of those have directly led to a collapse in business confidence. So does the Secretary of State think those decisions help Stellantis to stay or go?
I can tell them categorically they had no impact whatsoever. And I think crucial point is, I mean, I hear honourable members from the Conservative Party say this. Do you have any idea about employment conditions in the automotive sector? They're well above the floor the Employment Rights Bill raises this to in the United Kingdom. I mean, get out and talk to industry and have these conversations, please. Look, I'll just be clear. On the wider point he makes on business confidence, I recognise that the absolutely outrageous inheritance this government walked in on, where Conservative members did not plan to even say how they would pay for the existing promises that they made. That created speculation about where that revenue would come from, and I regret the fact we've had to make difficult decisions. I wouldn't ideally have wanted to have to make those decisions, but we are the people fixing the foundations and clearing up the mess the Conservative Party left behind, and there can be no long-term prosperity unless you have a serious government willing to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to the House to my register of interests. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in paying tribute to my good friend and colleague, the MP for Luton South and South Bedfordshire, who is an absolute fierce champion for her constituents. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the news yesterday only highlights further the urgent need for a UK industrial strategy and demonstrates the challenges that the UK industry faced under the last government without the strategy in place?
Absolutely echo her sentiments in terms of our honourable friends, and agree very much with her statement about a UK industrial strategy. There have been and are particular policies that have been particularly relevant to the automotive sector, but what we have lacked across a whole range of key sectors for a long time in the UK is confidence and certainty that those plans will remain. And when people have talked in this statement about the actions of the previous Prime Minister in that intervention, that is exactly the opposite of what is required when it comes to long-term policy. So the advanced manufacturing sector is one of our 8 sectors in the industrial strategy. It is a sector of tremendous strengths in the United Kingdom, and our intention is to build on that, to grow that, to deliver even more success in future, and that's why it's such a fundamental part of our plans.
Thank you, sir. I commiserate with the workers at Luton who will lose their jobs. If Vauxhall is synonymous with Luton, then Ford is synonymous with Essex. The Minister referred to 800 Ford job losses, including at their research centre at Dunton, where many of my Rayleigh and Wickford constituents work. On electric vehicles specifically, I'm a free trader by instinct, but what China is now doing in that area is way beyond normal competitive practice. They are dumping electric vehicles very cheaply on world markets, a point highlighted by the chairman of the Select Committee. So what specifically are the government intending to do about that to maintain fair competition and to give British companies, including Ford and Vauxhall, a fair chance to compete?
Secretary of State. First of all, let me reiterate my words about his constituents and the situation at Ford. I would say if anyone, and I have faced this accusation before, thinks somehow the government is only listening to one part of industry or is responding to special pleading, I think the announcement from Ford, followed by what we have had this week from Stellantis, is proof that we do need to move, we do need to listen, we do need to look at some of the policies we've inherited and make sure they're working as they should. I reiterate my comments earlier on in the statement to the chair of the Select Committee. The Trade Remedies Authority and the system that we've inherited, we haven't changed. If Ford or any other company want to make that referral against unfair competitive practices, they can do that. That request has not come from any part of industry to date. And I would say, look, I wouldn't for a second describe the Chinese economy as one that operates on the kind of market principles we would be familiar with. But we've got to be aware that the fundamental threat from China comes from their commitment to research and development, to innovation, to high-tech solutions, and to being able to manufacture on scale. We are kidding ourselves if we think the threat is just somehow unfair competition. This is an economy that has an incredible level of ambition for the future, and that's why we've got to raise our game as well.
Chris Edgley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents will be impacted by this deeply worrying announcement. So can the Secretary of State confirm what discussions he is having with trade unions on this specific subject and what plans he has to mitigate the job losses on residents in North East Hertfordshire?
Again, I wish to place on record and recognise the situation facing his constituents and the support on offer for the government. He asked specifically about conversations with trade unions. Yes, I can confirm I had several conversations just yesterday with, for instance, the General Secretary of Unite, Sharon Graham, and making sure that what we're doing as a government and what is being negotiated on behalf of the recognised union for the workforce are consistent with each other. I do recognise that for many people in the local area, the offer of relocation will not be an attractive one. People have links, they have families, they have situations. That is on offer as part of the deal. But as the details of this emerge, I promise the House will keep members of Parliament updated and work very closely with them to ensure it's everything it can be.
Richard Tash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be honest, these job losses are a direct result of net zero, the previous government's EV targets, and what we are witnessing. Is the Secretary of State aware? Is he aware that car manufacturers across Europe are losing fortunes on EV production? They are trying to delay targets, and what we are witnessing is just the beginning of the slow, agonising, painful and tragic destruction of hundreds of thousands of direct and indirect jobs in the UK automotive industry.
I can certainly agree that we should be honest, and what the honourable gentleman said there was simply not correct as a characterisation of the UK automotive sector. And all I would ask him to do is don't listen to the government or even the opposition. Go and speak to the industry yourself. Go and speak to the firms involved in this. Ask them about their investment plans. Find out why the honourable gentleman is so out of touch with industry sentiment. Many of the problems in some other European countries have come from a lack of ambition on transition, because fundamentally, if we're selling 80% of what we make in the UK to other markets, there is no long-term market for internal combustion engines. You've got to recognise that and remember. And again, don't take it from the government, take it from industry. But I'm afraid on this one, again, as we had on our exchange, I believe, on steel a few months ago, honourable gentleman's just out of touch with what consumers and business want.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that, unlike the party opposite, this Labour government does not regard the words industrial strategy as anathema? And would he agree that UK industry in general, and the automotive sector specifically, suffered under the last government due to their laissez-faire, stand-aside approach?
Well, I very much do believe that industrial strategy is essential to the future of the United Kingdom. I still have hope that this will be something which is supported on a cross-party basis. I see no reason why Conservative members or anyone else would not support industrial strategy, and there have been Conservatives who've held the position or the predecessor positions to the one I hold who actually got this and believed in it, and I think did quite a good job in some quite difficult circumstances within the Conservative Party to do it. So yes, it's essential to this government, but I certainly hope the whole House will get behind our plans for Invest 2035, because the response from industry has been superb. It is what we need as a country, and we should all get behind that.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, it's a sad day for Luton and the workers there. But what the Secretary of State needs to remember is, of course, that this is not just about Luton. It's about the complete car manufacturing industry in this country. And there'll be workers up and down the country in the industry saying, am I going to be next? So can the Secretary of State set out his position on the conversations that he's having with other car manufacturers to make sure the same thing doesn't happen to them?
Well, I reiterate the points I made in my statement, that this is about the whole sector, that whilst we had a position that we walked in to find in relation to this particular plant on the 5th of July when we formed the government, I recognise that alongside that particular issue, there are sector-wide issues here, which is why we've been having these conversations, and it's why we're willing to show the pragmatism we had in changing what we've inherited in terms of some of these policies to make sure they're working in a way which works for British industry. So you asked about specific conversations we've had. I said in my statement we had a meeting with all the major UK-based OEMs and wider representatives of the sector just last week to talk about the kind of flexibilities that might be required in order to make this policy work in a way which doesn't undermine British industry, but gets us to the common destination industry and government and consumers hold together. So that is exactly what we are doing, and I would ask Conservative members, wherever they feel about the previous government's policy, to get behind that ambition too.
Tessa Munn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Success in transition to electrical vehicles is vital for the West Country and for Somerset in particular, with the new Agratas battery plant which is coming to Somerset, and actually the Port of Bristol, through which 500,000 vehicles a year go. Will the Secretary of State act to support consumers and consumer confidence through restoring the plug-in grant, please?
Secretary of State.
I can certainly assure my honourable member that I will do everything I can to bolster consumer confidence. I say all the time, the products made in the United Kingdom are great. If people, again, are unaware of just how great they are, go and book yourselves a test drive, go and visit the production lines, go and see how brilliant it is. The Agritas factory is an incredible investment. It will be a significant part. I've always said, for the long-term future of this particular sector, we must make the batteries in the United Kingdom. Ultimately, vehicles over the long term will be made where the batteries are made, and we've got to recognise that's a key part of the industrial strategy for this sector that needs to go forward. I can't make a particular announcement on the plug-in grant. As you will know, it's not within the Department of Business and Trade, but I can confirm to her that across government, whether it is the Treasury, whether it is the Department for Transport, the Department for Energy and Net Zero, we are all united in wanting to make this transition a success and willing to listen to honourable members like yourself and industry as to the policies necessary to do that.
Richard
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And in the Secretary of State's statement, he mentioned those job losses also at Ford at Dunton in my constituency. And can I thank the Shadow Minister, the MP for Croydon West, for speaking to me on the phone earlier this week about those job losses. I very much welcome the fast track of the review that the Secretary of State is putting forwards, but I also agree with my right honourable friend, the member for Raleigh and Wickford and the chair of the Select Committee that we really do need to look after the manufacturers I've spoken to about the Chinese electric car dumping potentially in the UK, and anything that, can he speak to that? But can he also answer as to whether the concerns have also been raised with me from local car manufacturers about the increase in vehicle excise duty on some models in the budget, and if there is any possibility of perhaps looking at some of those issues again, because that is also having an impact on some of the demand for these vehicles in the UK.
Thank the honourable member for his question, and I'm grateful we've been able to get him some time with ministers about the serious situation affecting his constituents, which members of this government will always take seriously, as I do believe previous government ministers have under the previous administration. The particular issue around vehicle excise duty, I think he's referring to in the budget, obviously a question really for the Treasury and the Chancellor, but the differential that exists from the changes in the budget between internal combustion engines and electric vehicles is actually one of the demand incentives that now exists within the system for it. So I think everyone would recognise government should be doing everything it can to support industry around this transition, and measures like that are part of the answer. But of course, if he's got specific concerns, we'd always be willing to listen to those.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State was very robust in his criticism of the previous government and their approach to ZEV mandate. But wasn't the Secretary of State one of 141 Labour MPs who voted for that ZEV mandate?
Secretary of State.
Absolutely clear. The ZEV mandate that the previous Conservative government put forward, we worked constructively with them, and I believe in incentives towards the transition. I'm not arguing against that. It was the sheer brass neck that I reacted to of the opposition front bench for somehow not even recognising it was their policy that we were willing to change and presenting it as if the argument was the other way round. So I will be quite robust when the facts are as the facts are and the opposition front bench aren't willing to accept that. But look, I say again, we want this transition to work. It's not about the destination. It's not about, particularly even in this regard, the thresholds. It's about the flexibilities, how the policy operates, what it is currently meaning for market conditions in the United Kingdom. I think that is an entirely reasonable and proper response to what we have found walking through the door as a new government. And again, I see no reason why people can't pragmatically get on board and support that.
Lisa Smart.
Mr. Speaker, one of the things that's stopping some of my constituents from transitioning to electric vehicles is a lack of access to charging points. He will know as a constituency neighbour that some of the housing stock in my patch lends itself more easily to personalised charging points than others. So what more can the government do to ensure everyone can access charging points to make the transition to EVs?
Thank you. Absolutely agree that is one of the concerns consumers have. I think that the principal concern for consumers on EV take-up is the cost of the vehicle itself, but this is, and she will know from our constituencies, it is difficult in some places to envisage the kind of infrastructure some people might take for granted in areas that have more capacity to have that built into properties and driveways. There are about 70,000 public chargers, EV chargers in the United Kingdom. It's important to recognise there's not always an equity across different parts of the country around that, but a lot of people are surprised to learn. I think we have more public chargers than, for instance, Norway has, which is very much the leader in electric vehicle rollout. There was specific money in the budget to expand the rollout of charge points, to build on that 70,000 already in place. But I think she's right to say it's a key concern to be taken into consideration, not just the overall number, but the equity of those around the country. I can promise that the Department of Transport is interested in that too.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his statement, and in particular for his honesty. It's important to have that and whenever we look at the bleak things we have before us, and thank him for that. The Minister will understand that with the cost of living crisis that our constituents are struggling through, the last thing on their mind is to afford, forgive me, an all-singing, all-dancing electric car when they're clearly struggling to pay their electric bill. The closure of the plant, which specifically highlights the lack of passion for electric cars, can come as no surprise. So what can Government and the Minister do to make electric cars affordable for everyone, which would, I believe, enhance the need for car manufacturers once again? Thank you so much.
I'm grateful to him for his question in the way that he has put it. He's right to say cost of living concerns are paramount. I think we've got to recognise as well the cost of petrol and diesel is often, at many times, a key consideration in overall household finances. But he asked specifically, what can we do to bring down the cost of that? Now, that is about co-investing with industry in the most efficient forms of production. I think he mentions an all-singing, all-dancing EV. That there's a whole range of vehicles available, and actually many of our producers have led on the kind of family cars. I mean, the Nissan Leaf is a great example of that, made by some of my former school friends in Sunderland. We should get behind that and talk about how great those products are. But fundamentally, we do now need to bring down the cost, not just of the charging infrastructure, but of the unit cost itself. That can only be done by investment in efficient production and scale production, and that's why the destination is so important. But working with industry on that destination is key to delivering the outcomes I think he and I want.
That concludes that statement. We'll just give the front benches a few moments to swap over for the next statement. The Minister, Dame Diana Johnson, for the next statement. Minister.